Welcome. Tonight we wander through the shadowed streets and candlelit rooms of 19th century St. Petersburg, where a young boy named Fyodor Dostoevsky begins to quietly notice the world around him. The snow falls thick against the tall grey buildings, muffling the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, and you almost feel the chill seep through the walls of his family's home. You'd probably not last a week in this household, with its mixture of strict formality and emotional unpredictability. Yet here you are, tracing the small footprints of a mind that will one day reshape literature itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, perhaps type your location and the local time into the comments. It's a quiet way to connect across centuries. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step lightly into Fyodor's childhood, noticing how the small details seemed larger when you were young. The boy experiences the loss of his mother at an early age, and the cold, detached authority of his father leaves a mark that will quietly echo throughout his writing. It is said that he was an unusually sensitive child, prone to vivid imaginings and sudden bursts of emotion, and you can almost feel the tension of his curiosity pressing against the rigid boundaries of his home. Historians still argue whether this early exposure to both tenderness and neglect laid the foundation for the deep psychological insight in his later novels. Imagine him huddled near a flickering stove, sketching tiny scenes from his imagination or replaying overheard conversations, his mind already wandering toward questions of morality and human suffering. He listens carefully to the servants' gossip, the clinking of dishes, the occasional argument echoing from the corridors, cataloging every sound with the intensity of a detective of human nature. A little-known fact is that Dostoevsky once claimed to have developed a habit of eavesdropping as a child, not out of malice, but as a way to understand people, a practice that would later become a hallmark of his novels. You feel the tension between his longing for freedom and the invisible chains of societal expectation. In his room, surrounded by the faint scent of old paper and wax, he begins to scribble stories, small experiments with language, tone and character, perhaps not yet realizing that this playful scribbling is the first stirrings of literary genius. There is a quiet rhythm to his days, punctuated by walks through the narrow streets, watching pedestrians, merchants, and street performers, all feeding the young mind with endless material. The shadow of death and impermanence hovers gently in the background. His mother's early passing instills a keen awareness of fragility, and he begins to notice that every human interaction contains a subtle, unspoken weight. By the time he reaches his early adolescence, Dostoevsky is already collecting observations and emotional impressions, storing them like careful notes in a hidden mental notebook. These early moments of reflection, paired with an innate empathy, allow him to sense both the beauty and cruelty of ordinary life. You might imagine him sneaking out to the bustling streets during twilight, observing the contrast between the warmth of well-lit homes and the cold, indifferent alleys. He absorbs snippets of conversation, the laughter of children, the occasional cry of a beggar, each fragment of life lodged in his memory. Historians still argue whether his acute sensitivity was a blessing or a burden, but you can feel the duality at work as he experiences both wonder and anxiety in equal measure. A small, quirky detail emerges as you linger in this early world. Fyodor had a peculiar fascination with the supernatural, often reading tales of spirits and unexplained occurrences late into the night. He sometimes confided to family members that he imagined himself walking through haunted mansions or conversing with ghosts of forgotten writers, an imaginative play that sharpened his understanding of suspense and the unseen layers of human thought. Even now, you sense how these formative experiences quietly shape the themes that will dominate his novels: the tension between freedom and fate, morality and temptation, suffering and redemption. Each encounter, every whispered secret in the household, becomes part of the intricate mosaic that will later emerge in Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, and beyond. You notice that the act of observation, begun in these quiet rooms, is already a defining feature of his life, a gentle yet persistent drive to understand the depths of human nature. As you step back from the warmth of his small room into the dim hallways, you feel the subtle pull of curiosity, the sense that the world is full of hidden motives and quiet tragedies. You sense the early stirrings of empathy, the habit of noticing details others overlook, and the seed of narrative curiosity taking root. It is a slow, unfolding process, delicate as snowflakes drifting down the streets outside, each one contributing to the complex landscape of a mind that will one day peer into the hearts of men with unparalleled insight. You follow Dostoevsky through the austere halls of his boarding school, feeling the chill of stone corridors and the stern gazes of teachers whose discipline is as rigid as the frozen streets outside. The young boy is small, sensitive, and endlessly observant, yet he navigates the environment with a mixture of trepidation and quiet defiance. Here, every step seems measured, every gesture under scrutiny, and you realize how much these early years of regimented education are shaping the careful mind that will one day dissect human psychology with surgical precision. Historians still argue whether the strict routines of these institutions instilled resilience or only deepened his sense of vulnerability. But you can sense both forces at work as you walk alongside him. Dostoevsky is constantly balancing between the authority of the adults around him and the small rebellions he allows himself. He sketches tiny drawings in the margins of textbooks, sometimes scribbles short stories on scraps of paper, and occasionally mutters observations about his fellow students' behavior, quietly cataloging personalities and quirks. One little-known fact is that he had a habit of mimicking his teacher's speech and mannerisms, a form of playful observation that would later blossom into a talent for crafting richly layered characters. You notice that these small acts of creativity are his secret defiance against the rigidity imposed upon him, a subtle way of reclaiming agency within an environment designed to suppress it. The rhythm of boarding school life is relentless. Wake-up calls echo through narrow dormitories, classes march forward in exacting sequences, and punishments, sometimes harsh and arbitrary, are meted out without warning. You can almost hear the scrape of chalk on slate, the shuffling of feet along polished floors, and the faint, muffled sobs of students pressed into corners by the weight of authority. Despite this, Dostoevsky discovers small joys, perhaps a moment of whispered conversation in the hallway, the thrill of a stolen apple during recess, or the quiet satisfaction of excelling at a particularly challenging lesson. Through these years, you notice the early roots of empathy taking hold. The boy is acutely aware of the suffering and triumphs of others, not merely as abstract concepts but as vivid, lived experiences. He watches classmates who are bullied, notices teachers who are lonely, and observes servants and staff with quiet curiosity. Each encounter is stored, catalogued, and re-experienced in his mind, building a repository of human behavior that will later populate his novels. Historians still argue whether his deep emotional sensitivity made these years more torturous or more instructive, but you can sense that both tension and insight are forming together like interwoven threads. At night, in the dim light of a small lamp, he writes letters home or jots down brief stories and reflections. There is a gentle rebellion in this private world, an insistence that imagination cannot be fully contained by rules or routines. He experiments with language, rhythm, and character, sometimes penning snippets of dialogue overheard in the dining hall or inventing scenarios inspired by school conflicts. A quirky detail emerges here. He often imagined entire conversations between inanimate objects, attributing to them the fears, desires, and contradictions he observed in humans, a playful exercise that secretly sharpens his narrative intuition. The boarding school imposes a rigid moral code, yet within its structure, Dostoevsky's inner life grows exponentially. You can sense his mind wandering during long walks across frozen courtyards, tracing the footprints of students and teachers, imagining stories behind every glance, every expression. This practice of careful observation, combined with the early pressure to conform, cultivates a remarkable duality, outward obedience paired with rich internal freedom. These years are teaching him how to survive in society, while simultaneously learning to perceive it with unprecedented depth. You notice how small victories, completing an essay, winning a game of chess, or gaining a teacher's faint praise, carry disproportionate weight, creating an early awareness of achievement, disappointment, and moral reward. Even minor injustices like a classmate punished unfairly resonate deeply within him, building the seeds of social critique that will later permeate his novels. Historians still debate whether the intensity of these experiences contributed more to his later fascination with suffering or with redemption. Yet you can feel the dual influence guiding his thoughts. Within the austere routines, Dostoevsky begins to read widely: literature, philosophy, even the occasional supernatural tale, and each book becomes both a refuge and a lens through which he interprets his surroundings. He questions motives, imagines alternative outcomes, and starts experimenting with empathy as a form of mental exercise, trying to inhabit minds far different from his own. The boarding school, harsh as it is, inadvertently provides the stage for these early intellectual and emotional experiments. You watch him navigating friendships, some fragile and fleeting, others intense and formative, all leaving impressions that he stores with meticulous care. These interactions, combined with observation of authority, morality, and peer behavior, quietly build the foundation of the nuanced character portraits that will later fill his novels. By the time he leaves the school, the seeds of literary curiosity, emotional insight, and psychological acumen are firmly planted, growing steadily beneath the surface of a boy who has learned to survive, observe, and imagine in equal measure. You step into the regimented halls and precise workshops of the Military Engineering Academy, feeling the metallic scent of tools and the faint tang of oil in the air, as young Dostoevsky trains in a discipline far removed from the quiet scribbles of his notebooks. Here, he learns to measure, calculate, and construct. His day is dominated by blueprints, drills, and the hum of machinery. Yet beneath the precision of engineering lies a mind quietly bursting with literary curiosity. You sense the tension between the rigid demands of a military career and the restless stirrings of imagination that refuse to be confined. Historians still argue whether his initial choice of engineering was a pragmatic escape from family pressure or a reflection of early fascination with technical precision. But either way, the duality of structure and creativity is already evident. Dostoevsky's first attempts at serious writing emerged during these years. He writes short stories, essays, and reflections in the margins of notebooks meant for engineering exercises. You can almost hear him scratching a pen across paper late at night, hiding these experiments from peers and instructors alike. Blending the concrete discipline of measurement with the abstract exploration of human experience, a little-known fact is that he once tried to craft a small story about a soldier who dreams of literary fame while marching in formation, a playful meta-commentary on his own life that hints at the themes of ambition and inner conflict he will later explore in his novels. You notice the young man's fascination with human behavior extends beyond the classroom. He observes officers, cadets, and laborers with the same meticulous attention to detail he applies to a technical drawing, noticing nervous tics, expressions of pride, and quiet acts of kindness. Each observation, though subtle, feeds the well of understanding he will later draw upon in crafting characters whose thoughts, contradictions, and moral dilemmas feel intensely real. This period cultivates not only analytical skill but also empathy, an unusual combination that makes his perspective uniquely rich. Amid the structured schedules, there are moments of rebellion and curiosity. During breaks, he might linger in the academy library, reading Dostoevsky is drawn to works by Gogol, Pushkin, and foreign writers, sometimes reading by candlelight long after his classmates have gone to sleep. You feel the thrill of discovery with him, the quiet excitement of encountering ideas that challenge convention, spark imagination, and whisper possibilities beyond the rigid routines of military life. Historians still debate the extent to which his engineering training influenced his later narrative precision, but you can sense a subtle intersection between his methodical mind and the careful architecture of his prose. The young engineer's personal life begins to stir as well. Romantic feelings, fleeting infatuations, and encounters with peers' families awaken emotional dimensions that will later populate his stories. He writes letters that reveal vulnerability, observation, and humor, capturing nuances of desire, awkwardness, and fleeting connection. One charming detail is that Dostoevsky reportedly had a fondness for dramatic flourishes in correspondence, sometimes signing letters with playful pseudonyms, a small theatricality that hints at his later fascination with performance, deception, and identity in human interaction. You notice how the Academy's combination of structure and challenge pushes him to endure hardship while expanding his inner life. Exercises in mathematics, surveying, and construction are rigorous, yet they coexist with late-night contemplations about morality, human suffering, and the subtleties of conscience. The disciplined environment sharpens his focus, but the creative tension between obligation and imagination is never fully subdued. You almost feel him standing at a window during winter evenings, snow drifting silently over St. Petersburg streets, pondering the inner landscapes of the people he observes, quietly practicing empathy alongside trigonometry. Even the mundanity of military life contributes to his literary development. Drill formations, hierarchical commands, and the minutiae of discipline provide material for exploring authority, obedience, and human fallibility. You can imagine him mentally cataloging scenes of human pride, weakness, and resilience, noting small contradictions that others overlook. Historians still argue whether these observations were conscious training for future novels or simply the byproduct of a naturally attentive mind. Yet the richness of detail he acquires is unmistakable. Amid it all, he continues to experiment with narrative voice. Short sketches explore moral dilemmas, psychological tension, and ethical conflict, often inspired by interactions with cadets or small episodes of injustice witnessed during training. These exercises deepen his understanding of perspective, empathy, and the delicate interplay between circumstance and conscience. One little-known tidbit is that he sometimes read these sketches aloud to himself late at night, practicing dialogue and inner monologue in hushed tones, as though rehearsing for characters he would meet decades later on the pages of his novels. By the time he completes his formal engineering training, Dostoevsky has already begun to bridge the worlds of technical precision and literary imagination. He possesses a disciplined mind capable of rigorous thought, paired with a creative curiosity that will allow him to probe the depths of human nature with unprecedented acuity. You sense how these early intersections of calculation, observation, and narrative curiosity quietly shape the architecture of his later novels, laying the groundwork for stories in which moral complexity, psychological tension, and meticulous detail coexist seamlessly. As you step away from the workshop and the dim candlelight of his study, you carry with you a sense of how a young man can inhabit two worlds at once, the exacting and the imaginative, the disciplined and the curious, and how the tension between them is precisely what sparks the extraordinary. In the interplay of engineering and empathy, of numbers and narrative, Dostoevsky's literary path begins to unfurl, quietly, steadily, and with a subtle yet irresistible momentum. You follow Dostoevsky into the tangled corridors of his heart, where early love and quiet loss mingle in ways that will shape both his life and his literature. The streets of St. Petersburg stretch outside, slick with rain or powdered with snow. But your attention is drawn inward, to the delicate emotions and personal connections that define this stage. You sense the intensity of feeling that a young man carries when encountering his first romances, the thrill of attention, the pang of rejection, and the subtle awareness of the fleeting nature of affection. Historians still argue whether these early emotional experiences were formative, or simply a reflection of youthful sensitivity, but you can feel the weight of them pressing gently yet persistently into his consciousness. Dostoevsky's relationships in these years are often brief, but deeply felt. You can picture him writing letters to young women, sometimes awkward, sometimes profoundly perceptive, attempting to communicate the unspoken intricacies of thought and feeling. He is aware of the fragility of human connection and the impermanence of moments, yet he immerses himself fully in every encounter, observing reactions, noting nuances of gesture, tone, and expression. A little-known detail is that he once fell in love with a cousin, an infatuation that was never fully realized yet left a subtle imprint on his later exploration of moral and emotional complexity. You walk alongside him as he navigates family pressures and societal expectations, balancing personal desire with the rigid conventions of the time. Early engagement and romantic interests are often mediated by class, reputation, and parental approval, and you can sense the tension between freedom and constraint that will later echo in his novels. Each episode, each exchange of letters or secret glance, builds his understanding of human vulnerability, the subtle dynamics of power and affection, and the quiet tragedy of unfulfilled longing. Historians still debate whether his sensitivity to these dynamics contributed to a heightened empathy or a persistent melancholy, but the imprint is unmistakable. Amid these experiences, Dostoevsky encounters loss in ways both gentle and profound. Friends die young, family members fall ill, and the impermanence of life becomes a constant companion. You notice the subtle way he absorbs these events, internalizing grief and using it to refine his understanding of human emotion. There is a tenderness in the way he reflects upon these moments, an awareness that suffering can illuminate character and that love and loss are inseparable threads in the fabric of existence. Even in the midst of emotional turbulence, he writes and sketches with quiet devotion. Small stories and personal reflections accumulate in notebooks, exploring the nuances of attachment, jealousy, and desire. You feel the intimate connection between life and literature in this period, as experience and imagination dance in tandem. One quirky detail is that he sometimes composed short dialogues imagining hypothetical conversations with the women he admired, practicing empathy and insight, honing his ability to inhabit other minds, a skill that will become central to his fiction. The process of loving, losing, and observing teaches him subtle lessons about human motivation, the complexity of conscience, and the delicate interplay of moral and emotional impulses. You sense how these early relationships prime him for the moral and psychological explorations that will dominate his novels. Even the pain of unreciprocated affection becomes material for reflection, insight, and eventual literary expression. Historians still argue how much his early emotional experiences informed the characterizations in works like Notes from Underground and Crime and Punishment, yet the emotional richness is undeniable. You notice that marriage and domestic curiosity begin to occupy his imagination in small ways. Even before his formal engagement and eventual wedding, he contemplates the responsibilities, tensions, and joys of partnership, observing the marriages of friends and family with a mixture of hope and critical analysis. This quiet attention to the domestic sphere will later inform his portrayals of family, marriage, and the social pressures that shape human behavior. You feel the rhythm of these years in small, intimate moments, walking beside a quiet canal with a new infatuation, exchanging shy glances in candlelit rooms, writing fervent letters that capture fleeting moods, and quietly recording observations about the reactions of others. Each moment becomes a piece of emotional training, building the psychological acuity that will define his literary voice. By the end of this period, you sense a young man transformed by the interplay of passion, observation, and subtle heartbreak. He carries with him a deepening empathy, a growing capacity to understand the intricacies of human desire and disappointment, and a readiness to explore the moral and emotional consequences of attachment in his fiction. The tenderness and turbulence of these years leave a quiet, persistent echo, shaping the depth and resonance of the stories he will one day tell. You feel the sudden shock of arrest as if it were happening now. The echo of boots on cobblestones, the abrupt command to halt, the cold bite of iron cuffs pressing against wrists. Dostoevsky's world tilts violently, and you are drawn into the raw, unyielding experience of being charged with political conspiracy, swept up in a web of suspicion and fear. The uncertainty of the moment, who will live, who will perish, who will watch quietly from the shadows, hangs in the air like a frozen fog. Historians still argue whether the authorities' paranoia or Dostoevsky's own circles of friends played a larger role in his arrest. Yet the transformative impact on his life is undeniable. The trial is brief and terrifying, more theater than justice, designed to instill fear and demonstrate absolute authority. You can almost hear the murmurs in the courtroom, the shuffling of papers, the tense glances of fellow prisoners, and the quiet gasp when sentences are read aloud. The sentence is death, only to be commuted at the last moment to hard labor in Siberia, a cruel manipulation that imprints upon the mind a deep awareness of life as fragility and the capriciousness of fate. One little-known fact is that Dostoevsky reportedly experienced a vivid premonition during the march to the execution site, imagining himself standing in the snow as the final order was read, an image that would haunt his imagination and reappear in later literary explorations of human dread. The journey to Siberia is long and exhausting, the snow and bitter cold pressing against every layer of clothing. Prisoners march silently, their thoughts internalized, their bodies pushed to the limit. You feel the grinding monotony of forced labor, the ache in muscles, the dull sting of frost, and the quiet camaraderie that occasionally sparks among men sharing the same ordeal. These experiences carve into Dostoevsky an intimate understanding of suffering, resilience, and the varied responses of individuals under extreme stress. Historians still debate how much these experiences shaped his later depictions of moral and psychological extremity, but the evidence of transformation is visible in every subsequent work. You notice the subtle changes in his mind as he endures Siberian labor. His previously restless imagination becomes sharper, focused by adversity. Each day an opportunity to observe human behavior under duress. He reflects on morality, faith, and the social hierarchies that persist even among the oppressed. A quirky detail emerges. Dostoevsky reportedly took note of the unique ways prisoners improvised small comforts, from makeshift games to silent rituals, demonstrating both ingenuity and the persistence of human spirit even in the bleakest circumstances. These observations embed themselves deeply, quietly reshaping his understanding of psychology and human nature. Life in the labor camps is harsh yet rhythmically structured. You can feel the cold seeping through thin clothing, the repetitive tasks grinding against patience, and the fleeting moments of reflection that become his mental refuge. He reads secretly when permitted, meditates on philosophical questions, and observes fellow prisoners with meticulous attention. Each conversation, every gesture, and even the silence carries lessons about endurance, morality, and the unpredictable patterns of human behavior. Historians still argue how much these Siberian years influenced the philosophical depth of works like the Brothers Karamazov, yet you can sense their profound imprint on his thought. Upon release, Dostoevsky carries with him a transformed consciousness. He emerges not merely as a survivor, but as someone deeply attuned to moral and existential complexity. The experience of being confronted with imminent death, then labor, then slow reintegration into society, leaves him with an acute sensitivity to suffering and redemption. You almost hear the quiet, reflective conversations he shares with comrades, debates on faith, justice, and human resilience that echo in his mind long after the snow melts. The ordeal also fosters a deeper connection to spirituality. Faith becomes both a personal anchor and a lens through which he interprets human behavior, suffering, and moral responsibility. Small acts of devotion, whispered prayers, and philosophical reflection become recurring elements in his later works. One subtle detail is that he memorized entire passages from religious texts, repeating them silently during labor, a practice that strengthened both mind and spirit while offering a private sense of control in an otherwise controlled environment. The return from Siberia is not merely a geographical shift but a profound internal he carries both trauma and wisdom, suffering and empathy, doubt and renewed faith. Every encounter, every observation during those harsh years contributes to the rich psychological texture that will define his novels. You sense how the extremes of punishment and survival sharpen his understanding of human nature, forging an ability to inhabit minds across the moral spectrum. Even as he steps back into the streets of Moscow, the memory of labor, arrest, and near execution lingers like a shadow behind him. You notice the subtle ways in which these experiences infuse his perception of ordinary life, the way people speak, the quiet gestures, the small acts of kindness and cruelty. These impressions will later populate his pages, lending authenticity, empathy, and profound moral insight. Historians still argue whether the trauma or the observation gained in Siberia most influenced his later writing. Yet the interplay of both is undeniable. By the end of this transformative period you feel the lingering echo of human fragility and endurance, the sharpened perception of morality and suffering, and the awakening of literary depth that will carry Dostoevsky through the next phases of his life and creative career. His Siberian experience becomes both crucible and classroom, teaching lessons in empathy, psychological complexity, and the resilience of the human spirit that echo across the pages of his novels. You walk alongside Dostoevsky as he returns from Siberia to Moscow, feeling the subtle thrill of freedom mingled with a lingering weight of memory. The streets are familiar, yet changed, as if he, and you, see them through new eyes shaped by hardship, reflection, and quiet revelation. There is a tentative optimism in the air, but also a profound awareness that life is fragile and every moment carries both opportunity and consequence. Historians still argue whether his re-entry into literary society was cautious out of fear or strategic ambition. Yet the careful balance he maintains between engagement and observation is palpable. The first months are a delicate negotiation between the past and the future. He cautiously reconnects with acquaintances and writers, attending quiet literary gatherings and private salons where ideas flow like gentle currents. You notice the subtle shift in his demeanor, more reflective, more patient, yet occasionally restless, eager to probe questions of morality, human behavior, and societal norms. A little-known detail is that Dostoevsky initially struggled to regain his voice in conversation, sometimes pausing for long stretches as he filtered thoughts through the lens of his Siberian experiences. Refining both insight and articulation before speaking, you sense the rebirth of literary ambition as he begins to write seriously again. The act of composition feels both sacred and urgent, a way to process trauma, explore moral philosophy, and capture the complexity of human emotion. He revisits themes that had preoccupied him before arrest: justice, suffering, conscience, but now with a depth sharpened by lived experience. His notebooks filled with sketches of characters, intricate moral dilemmas, and reflective observations on human weakness and resilience. Historians still debate how much these early drafts reflect personal catharsis versus deliberate literary experimentation, yet you can feel the fusion of both. Daily life in Moscow is punctuated by both routine and inspiration. You see him navigating the streets, observing pedestrians, overhearing conversations in, and listening to merchants bartering with meticulous attention. He notices subtle gestures, fleeting expressions, and contradictions between words and action, quietly storing these impressions for future novels. There is humor, too, in the oddities of urban life: eccentric shopkeepers, wandering street performers, and occasional misadventures, which he records mentally with the same care as his most serious observations. The intellectual and social networks around him offer both support and challenge. Fellow writers and thinkers engage him in debates over literature, philosophy, and social reform, conversations that deepen his understanding and sharpen his voice. He experiments with narrative structure, moral tension, and character development, aware that the craft of writing demands both discipline and empathy. A charming detail is that he sometimes read passages aloud to trusted friends, gauging reactions, practicing rhythm, and refining dialogue, blending feedback with intuition to strengthen his prose. Financial concerns, however, remain persistent companions. You feel the quiet tension in his daily life, as he balances writing with the need to earn, occasionally taking on translations or editorial work to supplement his income. These pressures, while challenging, also teach practical lessons in negotiation, time management, and the realities of professional life, all of which feed into his nuanced depictions of social and economic struggles in novels like Crime and Punishment. Historians still argue how much financial strain informed his exploration of desperation and moral compromise, but its imprint is clear. You notice the delicate interplay between solitude and engagement. Long hours of quiet reflection, often in dimly lit rooms or along snow-dusted streets, allow Dostoevsky to process both memory and observation, deepening his understanding of conscience, motivation, and human frailty. Yet he also engages with the bustling life of the city, observing contrasts between wealth and poverty, pride and humility, vice and virtue. Each encounter subtly expands his comprehension of character, morality, and the rhythms of human life. Small domestic and social moments provide material for both personal comfort and creative inspiration. Meals with family, quiet evenings with close friends, and solitary walks along the Moskva River offer textures of experience that sharpen both empathy and narrative insight. You can imagine him noting the quirks of conversation, the tiny gestures of affection or irritation, the fleeting expressions that reveal character, all stored with the precision of a chronicler of human nuance. By the end of this period, you sense a man reborn through reflection, trauma, and careful observation. Literary ambition burns brighter, tempered by experience, empathy, and the keen perception of human psychology. Moscow itself becomes both classroom and canvas, its streets and homes offering endless material for the careful observer. Historians still debate the precise timing of his literary rebirth, yet you feel the unmistakable momentum of a writer emerging fully formed, ready to explore the depths of morality, conscience, and the human condition. The gentle rhythm of daily life, observation, and intellectual engagement sets the stage for a prolific and psychologically rich period of literary creation. You can almost sense the first whispers of major works taking shape in the mind of a man who has endured, reflected, and returned, prepared to channel both suffering and insight into enduring art. You drift with Dostoevsky into the smoky rooms of gambling halls, where lamplight flickers across green tables and coins clink softly against wood, each sound carrying both promise and peril. His eyes linger on the spinning roulette wheel, watching the silver ball bounce with maddening unpredictability, and you feel the rising tide of anticipation followed swiftly by despair. Gambling becomes not just an activity but an obsession, threading itself into his days and nights with the rhythm of a compulsion. Historians still argue whether his gambling addiction was rooted in psychological need, financial desperation, or sheer fascination with risk, but the intensity of his experience is undeniable. The thrill of chance mingles with the crushing weight of debt. You walk with him through dimly lit streets after a night of losses, pockets empty, thoughts racing, and plans collapsing. The despair of unpaid bills, the pressure of creditors, and the humiliation of begging for extensions haunt his days. Yet he returns again and again to the tables, as though seeking something beyond money. A quirky detail emerges. Dostoevsky sometimes convinced himself that a single lucky streak would erase all past losses, a pattern of thought he later dramatized with painful clarity in The Gambler. You notice how gambling becomes both destructive and strangely productive. The highs and lows sharpen his awareness of human psychology, the tension between desire and control, hope and ruin, passion and self-destruction. He studies fellow gamblers with the same intensity he once applied to prisoners in Siberia, noting the gestures of triumph, the hollow laughter after a loss, the trembling hands clutching last coins. Each observation enriches his understanding of compulsion, desperation, and the fragile boundary between reason and obsession. Historians still debate whether this addiction hindered or deepened his literary career, but the connection between gambling and psychological insight is unmistakable. Debt weaves itself tightly around his life. Letters to publishers, friends, and even strangers reveal his desperate attempts to secure advances or loans. You can feel the pressure mounting, the gnawing anxiety of deadlines tied not only to artistic ambition but to financial survival. Yet, in this crucible of urgency, he produces some of his most powerful work. One little-known fact is that Crime and Punishment was written under immense financial strain, drafted feverishly to meet a looming deadline, the pressure itself contributing to the novel's intensity and psychological urgency. The cycle of gambling and writing intertwines. You see him racing to finish a manuscript so that he can secure funds, only to lose them again at the roulette table. Yet each return to the hall provides new material, fresh gestures, whispered conversations, sudden collapses of fortune that become fuel for fiction. It is as if the very act of self-destruction feeds his creative impulse, binding risk and narrative together in a paradoxical embrace. You notice the psychological toll as well. Sleepless nights, frayed nerves, and the quiet despair of promises broken to himself and others leave their mark. Yet there are also moments of humor, irony, and recognition. He occasionally mocks his own compulsions in letters, admitting the absurdity of his choices while simultaneously plotting his next visit to the tables. This oscillation between self-awareness and compulsion deepens his understanding of contradiction, a theme that pulses through his novels. Historians still argue whether his gambling addiction reflected a deeper philosophical engagement with fate and chance, or simply a personal weakness. But either way, the resonance in his writing is profound. In the midst of financial strain, Dostoevsky also experiences tension in personal relationships. Family and friends alternately support and criticize him, and you can feel the emotional weight of disappointment and forgiveness pressing upon him. Yet these interactions, too, feed his psychological insight. He observes not only his own weakness but the ways others respond to it. Anger, compassion, indifference, or calculation, and incorporates these patterns into the emotional fabric of his characters. The contrast between the quiet of his study and the noise of the gambling hall is stark. In one space, you sense concentration, reflection, and the careful crafting of sentences that probe morality and conscience. In the other, you feel chaos, risk, and the dizzying pull of chance. This duality defines much of his life during these years, a rhythm of control and release, discipline and compulsion, creation and collapse. By the end of this period, you sense the exhaustion of a man caught between destructive habit and creative fire. The gambling tables strip him of money and peace, yet they also sharpen his insight into the compulsions that drive human beings. Debt weighs heavily, but so too does ambition, pushing him toward works that capture the tension between desire and despair with uncanny precision. As you leave the smoky hall and step back into the cold night air, you carry with you the echo of coins, the hush of anticipation, and the quiet recognition that even self-destruction can become, paradoxically, a source of artistic power. You find yourself walking beside Dostoevsky through a quieter, steadier part of his life, where companionship and marriage begin to reshape the rhythms of his days. After the turbulence of gambling halls and debt collectors, there is now a gentler sound, the turning of pages shared between husband and wife, the whisper of pen across paper, the careful laughter that rises between two people who understand one another's struggles. His marriage to Anna Grigorievna, a devoted stenographer who first assisted him under the pressure of impossible deadlines, becomes both partnership and salvation. Historians still argue whether her patience or her practicality saved him more, but the balance she brings to his life is undeniable. You notice how the marriage begins not with luxury but with collaboration. Late at night, Anna takes down his dictated words at a pace that matches his racing imagination. her shorthand allowing him to capture stories even when deadlines loom and nerves threaten to undo him. A little-known detail is that their partnership began with The Gambler, a novel written under the crushing demand of a contract that threatened to strip his rights to future works. Together, in just under a month, they completed it, forging a bond built on urgency, creativity, and resilience. The couple's early life is far from easy. You walk with them through cramped apartments and cluttered workspaces, noticing the piles of manuscripts, scattered notes, and the quiet hum of concentration broken occasionally by laughter or sighs. Money remains a concern, debts never fully erased, but Anna brings organization and calm to the chaos. She keeps meticulous records, manages finances, and shields her husband from some of the pressures that once consumed him. You sense how her steady presence transforms not only his practical life, but also his emotional stability. This partnership allows Dostoevsky to create with new intensity. Freed from some of the logistical burdens, he pours himself into works that explore conscience, morality, and the human condition with depth unparalleled in his earlier years. Nights stretch into mornings as he dictates or writes Anna nearby, ensuring that each page moves closer to completion. Historians still debate whether his late masterpieces would have been possible without her, but the timing suggests a direct link between partnership and creative flourishing. Travel, too, becomes part of their shared life. The couple journeys across Europe, and you sense Dostoevsky's complex reactions to foreign cities. He is simultaneously fascinated and unsettled, drawn to the vibrancy of culture yet critical of the differences he perceives between Russian life and European ways. In Baden-Baden, the lure of roulette tables resurfaces, and Anna watches with both concern and determination, standing firm even as old compulsions flare. A quirky detail is that Anna once kept careful records of his winnings and losses, treating the casino like a ledger to remind him of the futility of chance. Her quiet persistence helps restrain his impulses, though not without struggle. Daily domestic life offers moments of tenderness. You see them reading aloud together, discussing literature, or simply walking through quiet neighborhoods, sharing small observations that strengthen intimacy. Anna's devotion is practical yet affectionate, grounding Dostoevsky in ways that soften his anxieties and heighten his capacity for creative work. You sense the comfort of companionship in the otherwise solitary act of writing, the presence of another voice offering encouragement, criticism, or simply silent support. Even as debts and responsibilities remain, there is newfound resilience in the household. They weather crises together, financial setbacks, health concerns, and social pressures, emerging stronger each time. Dostoevsky's understanding of love, sacrifice, and devotion deepens, not merely in theory but in lived experience. Historians still argue whether his depictions of enduring love in later novels reflect Anna directly or more broadly the lessons learned from shared life. Yet the resonance is clear. Through Anna's steadiness, Dostoevsky achieves what once seemed impossible: the ability to sustain focus long enough to complete complex, sprawling works without succumbing entirely to distraction or compulsion. You see the fruits of this stability in the novels that follow, works that capture the full range of human emotion with extraordinary detail and empathy. Behind each page stands not only the writer but also the quiet support of a partner whose presence turns chaos into possibility. By the end of this period, you feel the shift from survival to creation, from chaos to collaboration. Dostoevsky, though still vulnerable to old patterns, now moves forward with a foundation of companionship that steadies his hand and strengthens his voice. The marriage, imperfect yet resilient, offers both sanctuary and spark, enabling him to explore with renewed vigor the deepest questions of morality, conscience, and the human spirit. You now enter the period of Dostoevsky's life when his greatest works take shape, heavy with philosophy, faith, and the piercing honesty of human psychology. The study where he writes is dimly lit, papers scattered, ink stains marking the desk like battle scars. You hear the scratch of pen across page as he bends over crime and punishment, pouring into it not only the urgency of debt, but also the weight of his Siberian memories and his relentless questioning of morality. Historians still argue whether the novel was written more out of necessity or out of inner compulsion, but the depth of its exploration suggests both. In Crime and Punishment, the young Raskolnikov wrestles with guilt, morality, and the crushing burden of conscience. You feel Dostoevsky weaving his own struggles into the story. The financial desperation, the sense of alienation, and the yearning for redemption. A little-known fact is that some of the novel was composed during travels abroad, with Dostoevsky writing feverishly while trying to manage debts and avoid creditors. His own state of anxiety seeps into the rhythm of the text, sharpening its intensity. Afterward comes The Idiot, where he attempts something audacious, to create a truly good man in the character of Prince Mishkin. You watch him wrestle with the challenge, pacing the room, muttering to himself about innocence, faith, and the cruelty of society. The result is a novel that reveals both the possibility and the vulnerability of goodness. Historians still debate whether Prince Mishkin represents Dostoevsky's idealized self, his vision of Christ-like compassion, or his critique of a world incapable of embracing purity. Yet in every interpretation, the novel pulses with Dostoevsky's yearning for moral clarity. Then, as his pen races onward, comes Demons, sometimes called The Possessed. Born of his acute awareness of political turmoil and radical ideologies, you sense the urgency with which he writes, as though warning both himself and his readers of forces that threaten to consume society from within. He infuses the narrative with satirical wit and chilling prophecy, capturing the tension of a Russia on the edge of transformation. A quirky detail is that Dostoevsky once remarked in conversation that he could not write about radical conspiracies without recalling his own brush with execution, a reminder of how deeply personal history and literature intertwine. And finally, the Brothers Karamazov, his crowning work, vast and intricate, weaving together philosophy, faith, and the question of God's justice. You sit beside him as he crafts the story of the brothers, each embodying aspects of doubt, reason, passion, and faith. His pen moving with both exhaustion and exhilaration, the novel becomes a summation of his lifelong struggles, an attempt to grapple with the problem of evil, the search for redemption, and the possibility of spiritual transcendence. Historians still argue whether this was intended as merely the first volume of an even larger project, but what exists stands as an extraordinary testament to the breadth of his vision. The themes that dominate these novels, guilt, redemption, love, compulsion, and faith, reflect the full arc of his lived experience. The gambling tables, the prison camps, the passionate letters, the poverty, the companionship, all resurface in transformed form on the page. Each character bears traces of people he knew, places he walked, or feelings he endured. You can almost see him lifting fragments from life and carefully embedding them into narrative, transforming the ordinary and painful into enduring art. His writing process during these years is relentless. Long nights of dictation, urgent deadlines, and endless revisions test his stamina. Yet he presses forward with determination sharpened by necessity and vision. Anna sits nearby, managing manuscripts, correspondence, and finances, her presence allowing him to immerse fully in creation. You feel the unspoken rhythm of their partnership, her steadying influence enabling his restless imagination to take concrete form. Even in public readings and social gatherings, Dostoevsky carries the aura of his literary preoccupations. Friends and fellow writers note his intensity, his tendency to leap from quiet reflection to passionate debate, his relentless questioning of moral and spiritual problems. A little-known tidbit is that during some readings he became so emotionally swept by his own text that his voice broke, silencing the room as listeners felt both the rawness of his delivery and the weight of the ideas he carried. By the end of this period, you sense the culmination of a life's struggle distilled into art. Each novel becomes not only a story, but also an inquiry into the deepest recesses of conscience, faith, and human weakness. Dostoevsky emerges not as a mere novelist, but as a philosopher of the human soul, his words echoing beyond their time, probing questions that remain unresolved even today. As you step away from his desk, the ink still wet on the pages of the Brothers Karamazov, you feel the profound weight of creation, the way suffering, love, compulsion, and faith have fused into works that continue to whisper truths into the ears of generations.
You step softly into Dostoevsky's later years, where his life slows, but his influence deepens. The rooms feel quieter now, lined with books, manuscripts, and the gentle hum of family life. He is often unwell, struggling with epileptic seizures and bouts of exhaustion, yet his spirit remains unbroken. You notice how each day becomes a balance between fragile health and the steady pursuit of writing, reflection, and the comfort of loved ones. Historians still argue whether his worsening condition intensified the urgency of his work or simply forced him to conserve energy, but his resilience is unmistakable. Anna remains his constant companion, keeping the household steady and shielding him from unnecessary stress. You see her arranging correspondence, managing finances, and gently urging him to rest when he pushes himself too far. The marriage, once forged in the urgency of deadlines and crises, now matures into a rhythm of quiet support. Their children bring moments of joy and laughter, grounding Dostoevsky in the daily tenderness of domestic life. A little-known detail is that he often delighted in reading fairy tales aloud to his children, his deep voice carrying even simple stories with the gravity of philosophy. Despite health challenges, he continues to write and reflect, contributing essays and public addresses that shape intellectual debates in Russia. His moral and spiritual authority grows, and audiences listen with reverence when he speaks about faith, society, and the destiny of the Russian people. You sense the respect he commands, the way listeners lean forward, absorbing not only his arguments, but also the authenticity of a man who has lived through extremes of suffering and redemption. The public recognition brings both satisfaction and weariness. Invitations to events and honors increase, but Dostoevsky remains most alive in the quiet of his study pen in hand, wrestling with the same questions that haunted him in youth: the struggle between good and evil, the mystery of suffering, and the possibility of grace. Historians still debate whether his late writings reveal a shift toward conservatism or simply refinement of lifelong convictions, but the depth of his thought remains consistent. His final years carry both serenity and fragility. You see him walking slowly through familiar streets, pausing often, observing details as though etching them into memory. He greets acquaintances with warmth, though fatigue often shortens conversations. Evenings bring gentle reflection, letters written with care, quiet talks with Anna, and moments of contemplation that seem to stretch beyond words. There's no sense of finality in his manner, only the calm persistence of a man who has accepted the rhythms of life and death alike. Then comes the end, sudden yet peaceful, leaving Anna and family in grief, but also in awe of what he achieved. His funeral in St. Petersburg draws crowds far larger than expected, tens of thousands gathering to honor not only a writer but a voice of conscience. You picture the streets lined with mourners, banners carried in silence, the air thick with reverence. A quirky detail emerges here too. Some attendees brought well-worn copies of his novels, holding them like talismans during the procession, as if the words themselves had become sacred companions. The legacy of Dostoevsky stretches far beyond his life. His novels become cornerstones of world literature, studied, debated, and interpreted across generations. Readers find themselves reflected in his characters' struggles, while philosophers, psychologists, and theologians draw from his explorations of morality and faith. Historians still argue whether his influence lies more in literature, philosophy, or psychology, but perhaps it is in the seamless way he fused all three that his genius truly rests. You step back now from the man himself, but the echo of his words remains, whispering questions that continue to resonate. What is conscience? How does one live with guilt? Is redemption possible? His life, marked by suffering, love, compulsion, and grace, lingers like a gentle refrain, reminding you that even in the deepest struggles, the human spirit can transform pain into art. And now, as our journey with Dostoevsky draws to a close, you can let the questions and images fade softly into the background of your mind. The echo of turning pages, the quiet scratch of pen on paper, the dim glow of lamplight, all these details linger like a lullaby of memory. You have walked with him through childhood shadows, harsh prisons, frantic gambling halls, and tender moments of companionship, and now gently you step back, leaving the figure seated at his desk, absorbed in thought as though he will continue writing long after you drift into sleep. The rhythm of his life becomes a slow and steady pulse, like the sound of your own breathing as you lie here now. Each novel, each reflection, each whispered prayer of his characters is part of a greater tapestry that stretches far beyond time. You can imagine him gazing out of a frosted window, the snow falling quietly outside, his thoughts carrying him between despair and hope, darkness and light. That image, soft and still, becomes a place of rest for your own thoughts tonight. Let yourself sink into the calm of knowing that questions need not be answered immediately. Like Dostoevsky's characters, you may carry uncertainties, doubts, or even quiet struggles, but in this moment, it is enough simply to rest. The world will wait, and the questions will still be there tomorrow. For now, there is only stillness, the hush of night, and the comfort of letting go. Breathe deeply, and allow the final traces of this story to dissolve into calm silence. You are safe, you are at rest, and you can let sleep take you gently. Like the closing of a book after a long and thoughtful evening,